He has extensive experience of training banking and financial services professionals in the United Kingdom, including staff from the Bank of England. As a leading modern monetary theory economist, he has given seminars on modern money at the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet in Canberra, for the Economic Society of Australia, and for many other institutions. In recent years, he has looked to combine ecological economics and MMT and offered short courses in the economics of ecological sustainability and social justice for activists and others all over Australia. He regularly appears in the media and published the 2018 book, Economics for Sustainable Prosperity. He is a visiting faculty member of Bennington College for fall of 2023. It is an honor and pleasure to have Stephen Hale with us. Please give him a warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much for coming. I'd like to thank you for inviting me. I'd also like to thank Susan Borden and Liz Coleman for looking after me and my colleague Gabrielle Bond. Well, we've had a great time in the US, both in New York and in Bennington, and it was terrific to spend a weekend with students at Bennington College and the local community. I've been asked to talk to you about modern monetary theory, which is a largely new approach to describing the monetary system, which has transformed the view that a lot of people have about public finance, at least at the federal level, and has implications for public policy generally. What I'd like to do, first of all, is to give you an advert in the form of a 90-second. If this doesn't play very well for people online, I do apologise, but it's only 90 seconds long. An advert for a movie called Finding the Money, which is about modern monetary theory, and which is doing the rounds of the film festivals at the moment, and hopefully will soon get a general release across the US.
So much of the public discourse, it's like we're going through life with one eye shut and one eye open, and we're only getting half the picture. And then somebody like me comes in and says, let's make sure we see the full picture.
New worries today over the exploding federal debt.
The federal government is
We're
broke.
bankrupting our country. We want to lift this crushing burden of debt off our children and grandchildren.
The government debt is not a burden on anyone.
The national debt is exactly the opposite of what the orthodox story tells us.
And unconventional economic theory is gaining some traction. Modern monetary theory, MMT. One of its leading proponents is Professor Stephanie Kelton.
One of the most influential and indeed controversial economists in America today.
In conventional wisdom, surpluses are good, deficits are
We're
bad.
borrowing trillions of dollars from China.
Does the government have to borrow dollars? No, of course not.
The federal government is where the money comes from.
When a fringe economic theory goes mainstream, you better pay attention.
You could take the national debt clock that scares everyone and just rename it the US dollar savings clock. I think everybody would have a very different kind of reaction.
The true story of money is not the story that I've been told.
Anyway, I urge you, when you get the opportunity, to see that movie. It features Stephanie, who's a great friend of ours, who for a while was the senior economist on the Democrat side of the Senate Budget Committee in Washington, D.C. Our mission this century, as it says there, should we choose to accept it, is to learn to live within our planetary boundaries and to focus on improving people's quality of life rather than just growing the economy for the sake of growing the economy, because of course climate change and other ecological issues are increasingly obviously going to be the major or one of the major concerns of the next few decades, one of the major challenges that we have to meet as a species if our grandchildren and great-grandchildren are going to enjoy at least the same quality of life that we've enjoyed. What we need to do is to build the infrastructure of a future post-growth economy, in my opinion. But the question is, how are you going to pay for it? If you're going to have a Green New Deal, how are you going to pay for it? If you're going to have an Inflation Reduction Act, which begins to act as far as climate change and other ecological issues are concerned. How are you going to pay for it? We need to get past myths which have been baked into our thinking by the training in economics that many of us, including me, have had in the 20th century. The economic ideas that we need to grapple with in the 21st century are different to those with which we are familiar that still dominate policy narratives today, and for that matter dominated Paul Krugman's column this morning, if anyone wants to ask me about that, if you happen to have read it. One of these myths, of course, is that nature is a boundless resource, that there are limitless resources that we can extract from our natural environment, and that our natural environment can serve as a limitless sink for our waste without there being consequences for us to deal with. The other one, which we're going to focus on this evening, is that the US dollar is a scarce commodity, that the US federal government can be forced into insolvency, that there is ever going to be a financial crisis relating to the federal government in the United States being unable to borrow its own currency. This is the kind of statement that we are surrounded with. We can't find the money to save ourselves. The debt is the biggest threat that there is to our grandchildren. That's what we heard a couple of politicians saying in that excerpt from Stephanie's movie. And this is based really on a conventional narrative as far as economics is concerned, which is at least 70 years old. It goes back to the first edition of Paul Samuelson's Economics just after the Second World War. We've had generation after generation of Econ 101 textbooks since then, the best-selling one at the moment being by somebody called Greg Mankiw at Harvard University, but very much in the same tradition. If we're going to question that tradition, we need to go back to basics. We need to think about where currencies like the US dollar come from. Now, we could go back here 5,000 years and talk about the introduction of the first currencies which have some things in common with our modern currencies, our modern monies in Mesopotamia. We could be talking about the introduction of currencies in the colonial states in the US round about the time of the War of Independence. But I know a little bit more about how the British Empire, after I was born in England, introduced its own currency into African state after African state, and indeed across the rest of the world where the British Empire invaded and colonised countries. And this is how they did it. It's how they did it in South Africa, it's how they did it in Ghana, it's how they did it in various places across Africa. If you invade a country, if you colonise a country, and you want the locals to work for you, you want them to build roads, you want them to put up building structures, you want them to provide you with food, you want them to provide you with a variety of services, well, you can enslave them, I suppose, but something else that you can do is you can impose tax liabilities. If you've got laws in place, if you've got a legal system, if you've got a police force, if you've got an army, you can impose tax liabilities, for example, in the form of a hut tax. You have to pay me a tax using coins with Queen Victoria's head on, or I'll demolish your home, and perhaps I'll lock you in prison, or maybe I'll enslave you. Oh, you don't have any coins with Queen Victoria's head on. Don't worry. I'll give you some. You can come and work for me. You can build that road. You can work on a plantation. I'll pay you some of these coins. Then once you've got Queen Victoria's head, you'll be able to pay your taxes. You won't lose your hut. If you don't want to work for me, you can provide goods and services to other people that are working for me. And you can get Queen Victoria's money that way. And then you'll be able to pay your taxes in any case. And you'll extinguished your tax liability to me. What have I done by imposing a tax liability on the population, on the private sector? I have created a demand for my currency. While you have to pay federal taxes in US dollars, there will always be a demand for the US dollar as that which is necessary to pay taxes. In ancient Mesopotamia, there was a demand for the first fiat currencies because that was necessary to pay your taxes. In the British Empire in Africa, there was a demand for the currency with Queen Victoria's head on because that was what you needed to pay your taxes. We're already getting the idea. Those governments didn't need the taxpayers' money. It isn't the taxpayers' money, it's the government's money. What those governments needed was for the private sector to need the government's money. It's precisely the other way around, and it still is today. So you impose a tax, or if we were going back thousands of years, we might call it a tribute or a tithe. You impose tax liabilities payable in a new currency. Then you spend your currency tokens into existence. Those coins with Queen Victoria's head on. You'll have to collect some of them back, of course, that's the whole point in the first place. But if you don't collect back as many as you spend into the system, those remaining coins will remain out there in the private sector. They'll be the savings of the private sector. Now, what are you doing? You're running a deficit. Are you going to run out of the ability to issue coins with Queen Victoria's head on? No, you're not. That's not why you're collecting taxes in the first place. Moreover, your deficit is the private sector's surplus. It's what the private sector then has available to spend and to save. That is the way that ancient monetary systems worked. It's also the basic fundamentals of how our modern monetary system works. The US federal government does not need your money. It needs you to need its money. It's the other way around. Well, you could, of course, choose to offer things you might call treasury bonds. You could choose to offer people financial assets that they can buy with this money that you'll pay them interest on to reward them for saving. But that's a choice on your part. It's not an obligation. After all, you issue the currency. These coins you're issuing, they're probably made of base metal. I mean, sometimes historically there have been coins with gold content, but they've still traded at above the intrinsic value of the gold included within them. We are talking about what we call fiat money here. We're talking about money backed by the power of the state. That's what gives this money its value. So, we can begin to see how the conventional view of how monetary systems work, what Stephanie Kelton, who we saw on that movie excerpt, calls the tabs approach to thinking about the monetary system. You tax and borrow if you're the government, and then you can spend. You have to go and get the dollars before you can spend them. It's not a correct description of how the monetary system works. It's a very powerful description because it feeds in to the metaphor of government as household, which is so easy for everybody to understand, but unfortunately is completely misleading. The tabs approach to thinking about the monetary system.
I think you've got the
I've got the
tabs
acronyms the wrong way around, sorry. The tabs approach to thinking about the monetary system, sorry, I put these slides together a little bit carelessly, obviously, relates to the diagram on the right-hand side. The acronyms are switched. What we have on the right-hand side here is FG standing for federal government. PS stands for private sector. We know what that stands for. The federal government wastes money, according to this story. It wastes a lot of money on entitlements to lazy people. It has various imaginative ways of wasting money in the form of different types of discretionary spending. And of course, it needs to find money to pay interest on the debt it's taken out in the past, the treasury bonds it's issued in the past, and to repay that debt. Because after all, you have to repay your debts. Where does it get its money from? It taxes the private sector. It can also borrow from the private sector. But you notice the private sector doesn't have much money in the first place. The government is bleeding the private sector dry in this story, in the tabs story. Fortunately, as Donald Trump would tell you, there's China out there as well, and you can borrow dollars from China because obviously the US dollar is made in China. Everybody understands that. But what are you going to do What are you going to do when the private sector has no money left? What are you going to do when China turns off the tap and stops lending you your own currency? The government is going to run out of money. The federal government is going to be insolvent. There's going to be a financial crisis. This is nonsense, but this is the approach to thinking about public finance at the federal level, which, in defiance of the evidence that I'm going to show you in a few minutes' time, still dominates the policy narrative in Australia, but in the United States too. What's the right way of thinking about our monetary system? What's the right way of thinking about monetary systems in general? The right way of thinking about the monetary system is that the federal government and its fiscal agent, the Federal Reserve, sits at the top of the monetary system. What I'm about to say, nobody would argue with because it's just technically correct. Every time the federal government spends $1, including when they pay interest on those treasury bonds which they choose to issue to fund managers and other savers, every time they spend $1, it increases every official monetary aggregate, every measure of the money supply in the United States by exactly $1. Every dollar the federal government spends into your banking system is the birth of $1. It's a new dollar. These dollars, of course, this sovereign spending creates the social and economic infrastructure on which the country depends and on which profitable businesses depend. So, why do we have taxes? We have taxes, as we were saying before, first of all to create a demand for the currency in the first place, as that which is necessary to pay taxes. But secondly, we have taxes, if you don't mind me putting it this way, at least from a whole economy, from a macroeconomic perspective, there are other reasons for taxing as well. But we have taxes at the federal level to limit your ability to spend, to create room within the productive capacity of the economy for the federal government to provision itself, to spend, to make investments, without driving total spending in the economy beyond the productive capacity of the economy and being inflationary. So that's the macroeconomic purpose of taxation, which is not the same thing as saying you need to increase taxes every time inflation picks up, but it is the same thing as saying, well, obviously we need federal taxes, otherwise federal government spending would rapidly become hyperinflationary. As far as treasury bonds are concerned, what's the right way of thinking about them? They're transferable interest-bearing savings accounts at the Fed. Since the early 1950s in this country, there's been the institutional practice, for a variety of reasons you could ask me about later if you want, to issue treasury bonds, to auction treasury bonds in the primary market to approximately match the deficit spending of the federal government. But that hasn't always been the case in the US. It wasn't the case where I come from in Australia until the early 1980s. And it's a choice. Treasury bonds play important functions within your financial system, but neither treasury bonds nor taxes fund federal government spending. Federal government spending funds itself as long as you can pass your budget through both houses of Congress.
Not so easy.
And as long as really you're the only country that has a debt ceiling. So if you want to ask me about that, Australia doesn't have one, so it's quite difficult for me to understand why anybody would do. But I know there are historical, political reasons for that. But politicians, of course, could choose to default on the financial liabilities of your federal government, but that's not a forced default, that's just crazy politicians if they ever do that, and there would be dreadful consequences were they to do that. Okay, so having said that, the TABS acronym should be with the right-hand chart. The federal government does not have to raise dollars by taxing and borrowing before it spends. Whatever the Congressional Budget Office says, whatever Paul Krugman says. The federal government has to spend dollars into the system, or the Federal Reserve on behalf of the federal government has to spend dollars into the system before those dollars are available to be used to pay federal taxes or to buy treasury bonds or other securities issued by the federal government. That's the right way of thinking about how the monetary system works. Now, this is not in itself revolutionary, but the idea that it matters is revolutionary. The idea that it's important for people, politicians, and economists to not misrepresent how the monetary system works, as I've said, has been transformative for how a lot of people discuss public finance. And this is particularly important in countries which enjoy full monetary sovereignty. And these are the countries, generally speaking, of the global north. So Australia is a full monetary sovereign. You don't need, I know the US, of course the US dollar dominates global financial markets, but it's not only the US which is a full monetary sovereign. Australia is, Canada is, Japan is, New Zealand is, Britain is, for that matter. There aren't so many, because to be a full monetary sovereign, you have to issue a currency which you collect in taxes, but it also has to be the case that that currency is not on a gold standard. The US dollar has not been on any sort of gold standard since 1971. You have to have a floating exchange rate. What does that mean? It means that you are not committing as a federal government or as its central bank, its fiscal agent, to convert your currency into anything that you could ever run out of at a fixed rate. The US dollar has been on a float for 50 years. You have to have no significant foreign currency denominated debt. That's true of the US federal government. It's also, for that matter, for at least 20 years, been true of the Australian Commonwealth government. So we're both full monetary sovereigns. There, it's true of the Japanese government as well. It's not true of Sri Lanka, Turkey, Argentina, or lots of other countries that I could mention. If you have US dollar debts, you are exposed to insolvency risk if you are a national government, even though you issue your own currency, because although you issue your own currency, you don't issue the US dollar. You can run out of US dollars, there can be a debt crisis for you. There can't be for the US federal government, not one that's forced upon it. And, well, if you're going to have a floating exchange rate, you need an economy which is resilient to fluctuations in exchange rates. And this is why a lot of developing countries are reluctant to float their currencies, because, well, first of all, they often have, as I've just been talking about, debt which is denominated in US dollars, which if your currency then depreciates against the US dollar is more difficult for you to service and repay. But secondly, they're often dependent on imported food or energy or other essentials which are priced in US dollars, and allowing your currency to depreciate rapidly dramatically increases the cost of living, can undermine social stability, and can inject inflation into your economy. That's not true of this country. If you have a floating exchange rate, if you have no significant foreign currency denominated debt, and if you have an economy resilient to fluctuations in exchange rates, you're a full monetary sovereign, and that has important implications. It doesn't mean the federal government can spend without limit. Well, actually, kind of it does if they can pass a budget through Congress, but it doesn't mean it's wise to spend without limit. It doesn't mean federal government has no spending has no consequences, because you have a limited amount of labour and skills and capital equipment and technology and institutional capacity within the economy, which limits the ability of the economy to produce goods and services. And if total spending on goods and services produced in the US by the government, all levels of government, the private sector and the rest of the world for that matter, goes beyond the productive capacity of the US economy, then the private sector and the government will be competing for scarce resources, and that will drive prices up and it will be inflationary. So there are real constraints. But it's useful to understand that the constraints are real, they're not purely financial. Monetary sovereign governments have no purely financial constraints. If you are Greece, you don't issue your own currency. You are not a monetary sovereign government. You could face real constraints where government spending was inflationary if you were operating at full capacity, what I've called full employment here. But for years, there has been mass unemployment in Greece, not quite so bad now as it was 5 or 10 years ago, because although the economy was nowhere near full capacity, if you're Greece, you do have to go and find euros before you spend them. You don't have your own currency. You can't spend your own currency into circulation in the same way that the US government can, or the Australian government can, or for better or worse, the Greek government could. In the 1990s, you signed your monetary sovereignty away. There may be good reasons for doing that, but it's a fact. But if you're a monetary sovereign, if you've got mass unemployment, and the US had more unemployment and underemployment than it needed to have from the global financial crisis all the way up to the pandemic, then don't tell me you can't afford to invest in repairing or improving your infrastructure, in the beginnings of a Green New Deal, in accelerating the rollout of renewable energy, because you can. You are not going to run out of US dollars. How did we ever let them persuade us otherwise? And that's what it says here. Monetary sovereign governments have no purely financial constraints. Does spending have to be financed? Yes. But how is it financed? Well, given that the federal government spends dollars into the system, it's financed when it's authorised. That's the end of the problem. We discovered this was the case in Australia during the pandemic, when we went into the pandemic, and our government had, the government does notionally have an account at our central bank, we call it the Reserve Bank of Australia, but there was no money in it. And then we had the pandemic, and the government announced it was going to do over $300 billion of deficit spending to buy treasury bonds. This is the same thing. This is true in the US, it's true in Australia. Funds have to exist in the private bank's reserve accounts at the central bank, at the Fed for you, at the Reserve Bank of Australia for us. There was virtually nothing in them either. It turns out, if the government has nothing in its bank account, the government is able to spend just as much as it could if there was $1 trillion in the government's bank account. We discovered that during the pandemic. The Australian government was able to spend without limit. Of course it was, it's the currency issue. As was the Japanese government, as was the US government. Now, what does that mean? It means people should stop saying that the US national debt is going to be a dreadful burden on future generations, that the government is bankrupt. What did that young woman say?
Right.
In the movie, broke. Because this is nonsense. Nobody who understands the monetary system could think it was anything other than nonsense. How can the issuer of the currency be insolvent? How can it be a problem to service debt which is issued in its own currency, the currency that it itself issues? It's really important to understand this, and it's also important to understand that government deficits are the same thing as private sector surpluses. When the government spends dollars that it doesn't tax away, those dollars go somewhere. They go into somebody's bank account. And I'm going to discuss this with reference to what Stephanie Kelton calls the most important chart in the world. Here is the most important chart in the world. I don't want you to think I'm making this up. So we're not just going to talk about the US, we're going to talk about those economies which the International Monetary Fund describes as advanced economies. There are 40 of those, and the US is one of them. And we're looking at the averages. Now, you might, if you really concentrated on that movie advert, you might have seen some symmetry in the advert there. There were some trees above a lake, and they were reflected in the lake, weren't they? Well, there's a symmetry here too, isn't there? It turns out that in every monetary system, always and forever, whatever period of time you're talking about, just as a matter of accounting, deficits and surpluses always have to cancel out. Or to put it another way, one person's financial liability is somebody else's financial asset. Or to put it another way, for every lender there's a borrower. There's two sides. And that's what we're looking at here. Now, if we look at these charts, when we're talking about the average for 40 advanced economies, trade deficits and surpluses with the rest of the world cancel out. Some of these countries will have trade surpluses, some will have trade deficits, and on the average it just disappears from the diagram. That's why the little blue bars in this diagram are virtually zero. It makes something very, very clear. The black bars relate to the private sector financial balance. If the private sector is in surplus, the private sector is receiving more income than it's spending. Go on.
What do you mean by private balance? How do you measure that?
Well, let's talk about how we measure your own balance. You're part of the private sector. If your income is higher than your expenditure, then you have a surplus. And over time, you can build up savings. If your expenditure is higher than your income, you have a deficit, you'll run down your savings, you could end up in debt. That's what a surplus or deficit is. Now, we can aggregate across all households. Some of them will be net savings, some of them will be net borrowing. They won't cancel out though, so we can talk about the household sector being in surplus or deficit. It is habitually, nearly all the time in high-income countries, in surplus on average. Then, of course, you can take not just the household sector of the economy, but the financial sector and the corporate sector, and we can aggregate them together and we get the private sector. And that's the private sector financial balance. If the private sector financial balance is in surplus, it means that in aggregate across the private sector, individuals and institutions have income which is in excess of their expenditure. It means that, if we were talking about it from an accountant's perspective, their net financial assets are increasing over time.
So they're saving?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's. If I was an accountant discussing this, I might not like to put it in those terms, but you're quite right. Yes. You're accumulating US dollars. If the private sector is in surplus, it means businesses, households are getting more dollars in their bank accounts. That's right, in net terms. So they're getting more dollars in their bank account, they're not getting more debts. They have to use those dollars to repay. Private sector balance sheets, you might say, as long as this is not inflationary, are becoming more and more healthy, more and more secure. Now, what do we notice? As far as the black bars are concerned, for the average of the 40 countries that the International Monetary Fund classifies as advanced economies, it turns out something is true every year, and I could take this back further, every year in my lifetime. I'm quite old. I was around well before 1990. What can you see for those black bars? Even just before the financial crisis, when everybody was going crazy with borrowing, what's true on average? The private sector is always in surplus. Now, for you to save dollars, those dollars have got to come from somewhere. For the private sector to be in surplus, somebody has to be in deficit. Well, there's the private sector, and as I said, as far as foreign trade is concerned, it cancels out on average. So if the private sector is going to be in surplus, who has to be in deficit? The government. And this is not a theory, this is just accounting. Or if you like, it's accounting. In other words, it's true. We're not talking about cause and effect or anything complicated here, we're just saying this is true. On average, at least as far as rich countries are concerned, governments run deficits year after year after year after year, forever. And that allows the private sector to run surpluses. I mean, those dollars in your bank account had to come from somewhere. They can be borrowed into existence, as we'll say in a moment, in the private sector. But if the private sector's in surplus, that's not happening. The only other place they can come from is the government. The government has to run a deficit. Next time people talk to you, why do we have, you might have seen on the first slide, I had a picture of an owl. Stephanie distinguishes between deficit hawks, who tend to be Republican voters, who think that the government should never run a deficit, or maybe in a major war, should, but not otherwise. We say they don't understand how the monetary system works, that they're in defiance of the evidence. I mean, governments just don't. Then there are the deficit doves, who would include, for reasons unrelated to all this, I greatly respect his intellect, but they'd include Paul Krugman. If you're a deficit dove, you say, well, you're doing a downturn, we should run a deficit, but when the economy's performing well, we should run a surplus, we should balance the budget on average over time. Governments don't. It's not the way the monetary system works when you look at the accounts. We call ourselves deficit owls. Why? That's a bit big-headed, I suppose, but blame Stephanie. Owls are, of course, famously wise. We understand the monetary system. Notice I'm not saying you should have bigger and bigger deficit spending forever. We're not saying government spending can't create inflation. We're not saying there are no constraints on spending. We're just saying if it turns out in a year or 2 or 3 there are all sorts of things that need doing in the country, and if there are spare resources out there, any politician that tells you they can't afford to employ those real resources to do the things that need doing is perhaps inadvertently lying to you. It's simply not true. Here is the US. Now you might notice the US chart doesn't look like the average chart, does it? I'm going to say something quite confronting now. Again, I greatly respect, for a variety of reasons, President Clinton, but he didn't understand this and he made some major mistakes. Perhaps they were forced on him. What we've got here, the red is the government balance. Yes, we can see, on average, rich countries run government deficits. We can see the US federal government. Well, this is the whole government, actually. This includes state governments too. You can see the US government usually runs a deficit. Now, if I just had the federal government, if I didn't include the state government in this, if it wasn't the whole public sector, then actually there'd be 4 years of surpluses there at the end of the 1990s, which at the time were trumpeted as a great achievement. How did you get this great achievement? You deregulated the financial system and allowed the banks to do what they wanted. Basically, that supported the economy while the government was withdrawing dollars from the economy, because remember what taxes do, they just destroy dollars from people's bank accounts. Federal government spending, it's not true of state governments, but federal government spending creates dollars in people's bank accounts. Federal taxes destroy dollars, delete dollars. Sometimes we sort of use the metaphor, we say the dollars are thrown into the fire, but of course that's not true, it's electronic, what we're talking about here. What supports the economy when the federal government is deleting dollars? Well, if we were talking about Norway or Singapore, the government could be in surplus and the private sector could be in surplus because the rest of the world would be in deficit, because those are countries that run big trade surpluses. But the US doesn't run big trade surpluses, hasn't run trade surpluses for years, and shouldn't try, because the rest of the world needs to get US dollars. The US is doing the rest of the world a service, in a way, by running a trade deficit. It means countries around the world that need US dollar reserves can get them without either borrowing them or depending on US multinationals making investments in their economies. So the blue here, that's above the horizontal, that's the foreign sector balance. The foreign sector is in surplus because the US runs a trade deficit. That's what that is. But it's still true that surpluses and deficits have to cancel out. So if the government isn't running a deficit, and the rest of the world certainly isn't running a deficit with the US, guess who's running the deficit? The private sector. You need to deregulate finance, you need to encourage a build-up in, well, initially there was the tech bubble, and then that crashed in the early 2000s, and then of course we had the property market bubble, and all the trading in new and exciting derivatives and credit default swaps that went along with that. And then of course it crashed, and when it crashed, the government, whether it wanted to or not, was going back into deficit again because the economy collapsed and its tax receipts collapsed. What we would say about those years, and what modern monetary theory economists like Randall Wray and Stephanie Bell, she was then, were saying about those years, was that the US government had got the balance of fiscal and monetary policy, the balance of what happens with private banks and what happens with its own budget balance wrong catastrophically. That private balance sheets, especially household balance sheets, were deteriorating rapidly in the US, and that there was going to be a major economic downturn. And that's why people got interested in modern monetary theory in the first place. Because almost the only economists who forecast the Great Recession were the MMT economists. That's how come it came out of nowhere, really. But as we can see, yes, the Government normally runs a deficit. What happens when the government runs a big deficit, like in 2020? It supports the economy, sure, during a pandemic, but that's when the private sector runs a big surplus. And it always makes me laugh. You can read in the Wall Street Journal or something like that, in 2 articles next to each other. There's one saying it's disastrous, the government's running huge deficits, and there's another article saying, isn't it good, households are saving a lot. It's the same thing. It's the mirror image. That's where the dollars are coming from. You don't want to do it without limit. It would be inflationary. But nonetheless, there's not a widespread understanding of this chart, which is why Stephanie thinks it's so important. What about private money? You might have seen somewhere people saying more than 90% of all the dollars in the money supply are created in the private sector as a result of bank lending. Absolutely right. Although there is a difference between private money and government money. Government money is the US dollar, which is issued by the federal government and its central bank. You and I could try issuing private money. A famous economist called Hyman Minsky, who founded the Livy Institute at Bard College near New York, once said anyone can create money because money is just a form of debt. The problem lies in getting it accepted. So if I was very famous locally and everybody knew that I was good for the promise and I went round signing IOUs, I promised to pay you on demand the sum of $100 US of government money, signed Stephen Hale, and everybody trusted it, and I was always around, it was convenient to see me, you might be able to spend my IOUs in the shop. My IOUs might become a generally accepted medium of exchange. In other words, a form of money. It's much more likely to happen to Bank of America's IOUs than mine, because they're part of the Federal Reserve System. So you can spend their IOUs. Your deposit with your bank is your bank's IOUs to you, a promise, a financial promise that your bank has made to you. They'll pay bills on your behalf using the balance they have at the Fed. They'll pay your taxes to the federal government, for that matter, using the balance they have at the Fed. You trust they can always do that. Of course, if you've got up to $250,000 deposited with them in the US, there's a government guarantee that you'll always get your money back if the bank fails. And when Silicon Valley Bank failed, of course, they just got rid of that limit as well, that guarantee all the deposits. Yeah? But actually, your deposit with your bank is a promise the bank has made to you, effectively, to, on demand, convert the IOU that the bank has issued to you, your deposit of your bank, into government money, into that which is necessary to pay taxes. So sure, the private banks create a lot of money when they lend. I like to say to students sometimes who are not getting this, undergraduate students, you've got some dollars, where did they come from? They came from my employer. Yeah, but where did your employer get them from? Well, clients spent money, where did they get them from? They got them from their employer. Where did they get them from? They've got to come from somewhere. They've either been created by private banks, which is the less secure way of doing it, weakening private sector balance sheets over time, or they've been created by the federal government through deficit spending. The banks are in a special position. They've effectively been franchised. Of course, they're licensed. There's a legislative framework in place, and the government has franchised them to decide who to lend to, because we believe, whether this is right or wrong, that bureaucrats working for the government wouldn't be the best people to decide which businesses to lend to. It's better to have private bankers doing it, regulate them. So the banks have been given this special position, which means we trust that our deposits with our banks are safe and that we can spend them just as easily as if we're carrying cash around with us, and we treat them as money. Why do we pay federal taxes at all? You always get this question. I hope I answered it earlier, but let's go just to go back to it. What did we say when the currency was introduced in the first place? You need tax liabilities to create a demand for the currency. That is how monetary systems were first developed more than 5,000 years ago. If you were taught at uni that we all used to trade with each other in barter systems, and then one day somebody decided that cowrie shells or gold or something were a good thing to use as a medium of exchange, and that would be convenient, and that was the beginnings of money. There is not a single anthropologist of money or archaeologist that agrees with that story. Nobody outside economics has agreed with that story for a long time. If you think money has anything to do with the earliest coins, coins are less than 3,000 years old. Money is more than 5,000 years old. It's much older than the technology to mint coins. There were other things used as money tokens long before coins existed. Anyway, it's always been the case that a fundamental function of federal taxes or national taxes is to create a demand for the currency as that which is necessary to pay those taxes. It's always been true that taxes have been important, of course, to delete dollars from our bank account so we don't spend too much, to create room within the productive capacity of the economy for the federal government to spend or to make investments. And then we have other functions of taxation, of course. The tax system doesn't do this nearly as well as it once did, but historically the tax system has been used to limit the inequality of income and wealth. And if you talk about things like carbon taxes or taxes on alcohol or tobacco, to limit things that we want to discourage or stop. But not to find dollars. And I'm not the first one to say this. There was a chairman of the New York Federal Reserve called J. Beardsley Rumsfeld, who gave a speech in 1943 that said exactly this. The title of that speech was Taxes for Revenue are Obsolete. And that was because during the war the US had gone, albeit temporarily, off the gold standard, and so did not have a purely financial constraint on federal spending. So why do we pay taxes at all? For these reasons. Let's just go back to it, because it's so difficult to change your mind about these kind of things when these ideas have been inculcated into our heads, to quote somebody called John Maynard Keynes from a long time ago. This nonsense has been inculcated in our education for years and years and years. For me, as well as you, don't put the cart before the horse. You can't pay taxes with non-existent dollars. The dollars have to be spent into the system before they can be taxed out. That's the order in which it works. What about the debt? Well, we heard Stephanie talking about this in the movie, didn't we? Actually, there are a variety of ways in which discussions of the US national debt are completely misleading. You might not be aware of this, but 25% of the government's debt is owned by the government. Just a different part of the government to the Treasury. So if you're thinking about interest payments on that, out of the right pocket, into the left pocket. 25% of the US government's debt, it is true, is owned by the rest of the world, but that's kind of essential, really, if you're going to continue to have a global monetary system, which for a while to come, despite things gradually evolving over time, will continue to be dominated by the US dollar. The world needs US dollars, and when China gets US dollars, if the Chinese government gets US dollars, they really want a safe asset that gives them some interest. If you don't ban them from buying treasury bonds on the secondary market, of course they're going to buy treasury bonds on the secondary market. You don't need them to. They're not where the dollars came from. And the rest is the savings of the private sector. If you've got a pension fund, whatever you call it over here, the fund manager will have some of your savings in this safe asset. Don't you want your savings in a safe asset that pays interest? Stephanie often talks to congressmen, and she loves doing this. She says to people sometimes if they're hawks, so you want the government to pay off all of its debt then? And they go, yes, of course. And then she'll say, so you don't want there to be any treasury bonds then? Because that's what it means. It means no treasuries. It means nothing for your fund money. Your pension funds have to find something else to buy. There won't be treasury bonds. It means on financial markets, treasury bonds wouldn't play the role as collateral that they play, which is central to the US monetary system. When you're oversimplistic and you just go all in for the government as household metaphor, or myth, as we should say, then you end up believing contradictory things sometimes without even being aware of it. What is the right way of thinking about the we really ought to talk about the net. But anyway, what's the right way of thinking about the debt of the federal government? Gross or net? Just this way. It's as simple as this. It's not scary. Every dollar the federal government spends is a new dollar. When they balance that spending against taxation, it just deletes the dollars again. So what's the government's debt? It's just the dollars they spend into bank accounts that they haven't yet deleted from it. End of story. That's what the national debt is. They issue the dollar, they can't run it. They can issue the dollar at zero marginal cost. They're not going to run out of the ability to do that. The US government, unless lunatics in Washington DC pass a vote to bring this about voluntarily, will never default on its debt. And it's not just me that says this. He's now left the Fed, but David Andolfato is a famous economist who you can follow on Twitter if you look around for him, who was the vice president of the Richmond Fed. And at the end of 2020, he published a note for the Richmond Federal Reserve where he said, we should just call the government debt the net money supply. We shouldn't call it debt at all. It's misleading in our monetary system. Stephanie and I don't really like that label because we know lots of accountants. And there are official measures of the money supply and they get a bit annoyed. So we would rather he had said it is the net financial assets of the non-government sector on the US monetary system. But maybe David's label is an easier one, a more effective one. So we don't need to worry about the national debt. Now, I'm taking a risk here, probably going on too long, but I just thought you'd be interested. Are there any good reasons to issue Treasury bonds? We sort of touched on some of them. Prior to September 2008, which some of us might remember, the Federal Reserve hit its target for the federal funds rate, for the overnight rate at which banks lend to each other, by keeping all the banks a bit short of cash. And then what they do is they just lend a tiny bit of cash for a few days and then roll it over a few days later and keep lending a tiny bit of cash. And this gave the Fed the leverage that it wanted to control the federal funds rate, to influence the rate of interest at which the banks lent to each other. So they did so at or very close to the target that the Fed had, without the Fed paying interest on bank reserves, because they didn't used to. Now, in those days, if the federal government, as it normally does, was to run a deficit, spending more dollars into the banking system than it taxed out, well, you know what would have happened to the reserves that the private banks had at the Fed? They would have piled up and up, because the government's spending, if they spend $10 into the system and take $8 out, there'll be $2 more reserves the banks have. And you'd end up with nearly all the banks having more electronic cash than they needed, nobody needing to borrow overnight, and the federal funds rate would have fallen to zero. In other words, the Fed would have lost control of interest rates, but not lost control upwards, lost control downwards. The official rate would have gone to zero, which they didn't want that to happen. And this is the reason why, for decades, the federal government has auctioned Treasury bonds to drain those reserves back again, because when people buy Treasuries, it takes funds out of bank reserve accounts at the Fed, so banks don't have a lot of cash, so the Federal Reserve can use that system to set the federal fund rate. Now, what happened after 2008? Do we remember? Quantitative easing. The Federal Reserve itself went on to the secondary market for Treasury bonds, but for other things too, and bought lots and lots and lots of stuff. Did it use taxpayers' money? But no, it used something like that computer over there, a keyboard. That's how difficult it was. But since 2008, the banks in the US have had massive amounts of excess reserves, so that they hardly need to borrow from each other overnight, or at least those transactions are much less significant than they used to be. So the Fed has a different way of controlling interest rates now. The way they do it now is they pay interest on these reserves, because at least as far as loans overnight between banks are concerned, Bank A is not going to lend money overnight to Bank B at an interest rate which is below what the Fed will pay Bank A on its reserve account. You get the idea? So if the Fed wants to raise interest rates now, they just have to raise the interest rate they pay on bank reserves. It's a completely different system. Why this is interesting is that this good reason for issuing treasury bonds no longer exists anymore. Done away with that, but there are some other good reasons. The fund managers hate it when anybody suggests not issuing treasuries anymore. I am in favour, as is Stephanie, of still issuing these kind of safe financial assets so that pension funds can buy them, but having the Federal Reserve issue them instead of the federal government. Of course, nobody has ever suggested that the Federal Reserve was going to run out of dollars. It just changes the discussion a little bit. As we said, treasuries play an important role in financial markets as collateral. As we said, you know, it's not that the US needs China to lend it dollars, it's that China wants the US to sell it treasury bonds. That's the right way around of talking about this. It is partly just because we've got used to it. Not all institutional practices necessarily make sense anymore, but if there isn't a particularly good reason for changing it, then it tends to just roll on. So that's where we are, even during the period when the Fed was buying the government bonds from the private banks. The government was still issuing treasury bonds and selling them to the private banks. The private banks were then just taking a sort of profit margin as a middleman, which is really kind of insane when you come to think about it, but good news if you're a banker. But it's a choice. It's not a necessity. It might be a choice you want to make. I have no objection to the US government continuing to issue treasury bonds as long as we don't have to put up with people saying the US government is bankrupt or running out of money or can become insolvent, because it can't. What about inflation? Well, this is where Stephanie, just before the pandemic, was making a lot of leeway. She was talking to the Congressional Budget Office and trying to persuade them to, instead of whenever they look at government spending programs and to, looking at the impact on the next 10 years on the budget, focusing on inflation risk instead, looking at real resources, looking at spare capacity in the economy. And then, of course, the pandemic happened and all these discussions stopped. But there's some interesting research that central banks, not just the Austrian central bank, but the Australian one, and the Fed too, have published in the last year or so, which has overwhelmingly suggested that almost the whole of the inflationary surge we had in the US, across Europe, in Australia and elsewhere had nothing to do with excessive spending relating to the government's deficits in the economy, but instead were to do with COVID, supply chain disruptions, and then we were just getting over that, and Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine, where a lot of the world gets its food from. Russia, where a lot of the world gets its energy from. So food prices and energy prices went through the roof. And the real, is this the right word, doozy? The real problem as far as inflation is concerned in the next few years is going to be climate change. It's going to be climate change. It's going to be that some of the world's most significant food baskets are liable to be faced with prolonged drought. So we'll have to worry about these issues. Of course, if you want to worry about fossil fuel prices and being vulnerable to them, then you need to make investments in clean energy faster. Lots of countries, that's true of around the world. Why are African countries importing fossil fuels? They should be on renewable energy by now. We have to think about how to fund that, how to resource it. If we're talking about paying for things with US dollars, we can always create US dollars. That's not a problem. Well, Isabella Weber has been very prominent in this discussion. Here she's sharing some research that the Austrian Central Bank has done, looking at the impact of energy and food price shocks, but then looking at what people sometimes call greenflation, monopoly firms taking advantage of confusion about what's driving prices up over time to build profit margins, at least for a while, on the quiet, without people realising what's going on because people are confused what's happening to the price level. And of course that, in the short term, adds to inflationary pressures. And you can then potentially, of course, have workers trying to defend their standard of living against the rising cost of living and bargaining for pay rises, which can add to the inflationary pressures. We're not here talking, at least not in any simplistic way, about increases in the money supply or government spending. That wasn't the driver of the inflation in the first place. So what Stephanie would say if she was here, and what I'd say, is that when you are looking at the budget, you need to think about, sure, productive capacity. I want to invest in these projects. I want to make investments in infrastructure, transportation, healthcare, education, all sorts of things. Do the people exist? Does the technology exist? Do the materials exist? Are they free for us to buy without it being inflationary? What about the secondary spending? What about people receiving this income spending it? Is there spare capacity in the economy to allow for this additional spending not to be inflationary? We just need to be a little bit more savvy about, sorry.
You're saying that the current inflation that we're having has nothing to do with the government spending, it's due to climate change?
I'm saying that not only me, the Federal Reserve says this. I'm saying that the initial impulse for most of, I think in the case of the Fed, they say 80 or 85% of the initial impulse of inflation was initially not to do with climate change in this case, initially to do with the pandemic and then the Russia-Ukraine war, and the impact that had first of all on food prices and then on energy prices. The way the economy works, the manufacturing sector, the secondary sector, depends on the primary sector. So if energy prices rise and food prices rise, soon you see manufacturing prices rise. And the tertiary sector, services, depend on the secondary sector because we use things to perform services, and on the primary sector. So it promulgates across the economy over time. You get a shock in the primary sector part of the economy and it spreads. Now, one way of reacting to a shock is to make people so poor they don't buy anything anymore, and businesses fail and have a major recession, and sure, that will deal with inflation. Of course it will. That's pretty much what Paul Volcker did 40 years ago. Very effective, but of course very costly, because it's much easier to lose a business than it is to build it up in the first place. So there will be medium to long-term consequences for that as far as the economy is concerned. But yes, I'm not saying it's nothing to do with government spending, in the sense that, as I've said, if we cut back on spending enough, then sure, prices and wages will fall. That's how we've had Great Depressions in the distant past. But there is no central bank in the world, as far as I'm aware, that argues the primary cause of the initial surge in inflation was to do with the deficit spending due to the pandemic. Instead, these are the primary causes that the central bankers tell us about, using their models, which I don't like, but nonetheless using their so-called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. This is what they tell us. And it makes sense. 2, if we are going to spend more, and if we are up against full capacity, you don't necessarily need higher taxes even under those circumstances, because there are other pay-fors you can look for. For example, we could move at least some of the way back towards what we used to do before the 1980s, when we used to have regulations imposed by the Fed, or in Australia by our central bank, limiting the amount of lending which private banks could do for certain purposes. Credit regulation. I'm not saying you have to go down that route, but I am saying if there's too much spending in the economy and the federal government wants to spend more, and you are in a political situation where it's impossible to tax more highly, there are other ways of creating room to allow for higher public spending and investment. But it depends on the political circumstances, the circumstances of a particular country that you're talking about. Anyway, having said all that, Johan Rockström is the world's leading Earth system scientist. And this is his message for us in a movie that he put out a couple of years ago. He is the man who is responsible, if you've heard of these, for developing the 9 planetary boundaries that ecological economists have been talking about for about 15 years now. Climate change is one of them, extinctions is another, there's 7 other boundaries, 6 of the 9 we are well outside at the moment, and it's becoming rather urgent to address these issues. So if we're going to address these issues, well, understanding the monetary system isn't going to get rid of all the problems. It's not going to mean politicians can't stuff things up or make bad decisions. It's not going to mean you can't get a spike of inflation. But it at least means we're talking about the monetary system the way it actually works. We're not building our narrative on a set of myths. That is at least a help. Then I think, but you don't have to agree with me on this, that we need to shift our priorities and think about what matters. What are the elements of a successful 21st century society? Not necessarily growing the economy just for the sake of it. Maybe the financial sector is a bit too big, for example. Perhaps we need to shrink it so that it takes up the share of the economy like it did 40 or 50 years ago. What should the mission of the government be? I don't know. This is not my country. That's up to you. But decide democratically what's important to people as far as their well-being is concerned. Measure what matters, which can involve looking at a panel of indicators, not just the size of the economy. And do your best to improve people's well-being while arresting the rapid deterioration of our natural environment, which we see around us, going around us at the moment. And I live in a very bushfire area of Australia, and we're just going to go through a really hot summer over there, so this is kind of personal for me. Of course, it's very hard. There are plenty of interest groups out there consisting of people who understand perfectly well how the monetary system works, but who don't want you to understand how the monetary system works because it's convenient for them and their interests. We have more of a chance of dealing with some of the ecological myths, which I think are important, but they're not really part of this talk, if we can at least get rid of the monetary myth. Finding the dollars to do what needs to be done is not the problem. Finding the people, the skills, the technology, the equipment, the institutional capacity, and the political will to do it is the problem. That's the problem. Finding the dollars really isn't. And I hope that, at least for 1 or 2 people here, you don't take my word for all these things, go and find out for yourself. But if you do find out for yourself, you might just be like me, because like we said at the beginning, I trained lots of bankers, including central bankers, and I didn't used to train them along the lines I've been talking about with you now. I changed my mind about 15 years ago. What changed my mind, incidentally, was one day we had a very senior banker come to a course I was running. The Bank of England had told him, now he was on the board of directors of the bank, he needed to get qualified. He'd sort of gone up through the ranks. And I did my best to teach the course. You probably know what I would have been teaching, sort of, because it was the conventional narrative. And he came up to me at the end and said, that was great, thanks very much, I'm sure I'm going to pass the exam now. But you do know it doesn't work that way. And I was rather arrogant at the time, being rather younger, and I didn't listen for probably 10 years. And when September 2008 came around, that's when I started reading Hyman Minsky and really started getting into the weeds of the monetary system, and I realised what he was talking about. And since then, I've had a different set of lenses when it comes to thinking about economic issues. And maybe you'll end up this way too, maybe you won't. One thing that you might find interesting and that might push you in this direction is to take a look at this great movie which has just come out, which I'm delighted about, called Finding the Money, featuring my dear friend, one of my best friends, Stephanie Kelton. Okay, well, thank you very much. I haven't
I'm really concerned about the inflation that we're having, and it seems like inflation has really jumped up in the last couple of years. It used to be like maybe 2%, now it's 4%, 5%, something like that. My question is, you're saying that it has nothing to do with the government spending, all the trillions of dollars that they spend okay, and build back better and inflation reduction, stuff like that. You say it's due to climate change.
No, I didn't say it was just due to climate change.
One was climate change, the other was pandemic.
One is climate change. We really are going to be looking at global food supplies being under severe stress in the next few years. That is, I'm afraid, you don't take my word for it, we just have to wait.
So the climate change is very slowly happening, right? But inflation jumped up
That's
really
right.
quick, so it seems that there's a disconnect there.
Well, a drought across much of South America didn't help much as far as food prices were concerned, but of course Ukraine is where a lot of the country gets its food. That did disrupt things. We've just been through, we've done pretty well, we've just been through the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. When I was young, they used to make me read the Bible, and I'm sure I remember terrible stories in the book of Revelations. We've sort of just been through. We've had the most awful pandemic for 100 years. Thank God it happened now with our modern technology and not 20 years ago. We wouldn't have been able to cope with it at all. That's tremendously disruptive. We had our supply chain severely disrupted. We have been rather unwise for the last 40 years. We have developed very complex global supply chains, which it turns out, who would have guessed this, are extraordinarily fragile if there is a pandemic. And then, just as we were getting over that, Russia invades Ukraine. Europe gets its energy from Russia. Europe's a pretty big part of the global economy. Ukraine feeds a pretty big part of the world. It's a big place, Ukraine. They grow a lot of wheat. That's had a major impact on the world economy, and that's been inflationary too. But if I'm looking at the statistics, US inflation's been, things might change now because we've got more disruptions coming up, but US inflation has been edging down a little bit. Again, not because of austerity. The federal deficit is still pretty big. Bizarrely, here's something else people don't understand. The main driver of the US federal deficit going up recently has been the Fed putting interest rates up. Who's the big payer of interest in the US monetary system? Who's got all the debt? The government has. When the Fed puts interest rates up, especially these days, when there are big reserves at the Federal Reserve, the interest payments that get paid to the banks on their massive reserves go up overnight. That adds to the federal deficit. And although if they put interest rates up enough, something will go wrong in the financial system. Eventually, if you push it far enough, there'll be insolvencies, and then you can get a recession. If you're just nudging interest rates up slightly, the way the US financial system is at the moment, it can actually push the economy forward, not back. It can have the opposite impact that a lot of people imagine. It's not simple, like interest rate down, the accelerator, foot down on the gas, interest rates up, brake. No, a lot of people are receiving more income when interest rates go up, and some of them are spending some of that income. So the relationship between interest rates and the economy is a complex one. It's not simple.
Yeah,
Go on.
the debt is much larger than the deficit.
That's right, because the deficit is what you add to the debt every year.
The bonds that were already sold in previous years, the rise in the interest rate doesn't affect the income.
No, absolutely, but a lot of those bonds were bought back by the Federal Reserve. They still count as part of the government's debt. The banks, the private sector doesn't own them anymore.
The interest payment doesn't go up on those bonds. It goes up only on the newer bonds.
Absolutely right, but the interest payment does go up on bank reserves of the Fed.
Oh.
That's what's happened. A lot of those bonds are now owned by the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve bought those bonds. They paid for those bonds by putting reserves into the federal funds of the banks at the Fed, and those interest rates go up. In fact, this is the policy tool now. When they increase the federal fund rate, that interest rate goes up instantaneously, and that has quite a big impact. Now, but you're absolutely right. As far as bonds still held in the private sector are concerned, the existing bonds, you don't get that effect. Something else which is true in the US, of course, is a lot of people in the US have fixed rate mortgages. In Australia, interest rates have a much bigger impact on us because we all have floating rate mortgages. And sometimes you don't get, these things are not discussed. Changes in interest rates do not have the same impact on every country. It depends how the financial system is organised, and it's changed a bit with the quantitative easing, which hasn't, the Fed's balance sheet went up it really hasn't come back very much as yet. There's a lot of excess reserves in the system. The system doesn't work the way it used to 40 years ago. But that's a great question. Thank you.
When the Fed raised interest rates in a short amount of time, 550 basis points, that means it's more expensive to borrow for
Absolutely.
a car, it's more expensive to purchase a home, and then you've got the people who have 2.75 mortgage rates. They're not gonna sell their house, because if they're gonna buy another house and they're gonna mortgage it,
You're absolutely right.
so those sectors have to be affected.
They are affected, but there are people like me who, for my sins, I used to probably got paid too much for trading bankers. I've got money in term deposits. I can spend even more. What is the case about increases in interest rates is they are deeply regressive. They hurt the people with the debt. They don't hurt people like me. In fact, I benefit. So it's complicated. On balance, you would normally expect an increase in interest rates to slow the economy.
Yeah.
But the US monetary system 2023 is not the same as the US monetary system 2008. It's a very different animal. And people don't often discuss this. And there are reasons to believe that the link between interest rates and demand, the job market's still really strong in the US. These are increases in interest rates. They haven't slowed things down yet. I'm not saying they couldn't if they pushed it far enough, but so far they haven't. And a reason for that is the system is very different now. Sorry.
So if you were advising Powell and the Fed on their next interest rate move, what would you tell them? Because I feel like what they're doing is completely making no impact. And that's kind of what you just said. So if you're in his seat.
I'd get him to talk to another friend of mine called Warren Mosler. If he talked to Warren Mosler, what Warren would say is, I'm sorry, Jermaine, they've given you a job you're not equipped to deal with. Not with the tools you have at the moment. Really, Warren talks about, as far as demand is concerned, especially the way the US is now, the Treasury being in charge and the Fed not. In fact, he's got a good sense of humour. So what he says is, the chairman of the Fed is like a child in a car seat, in a passenger seat of the car with a toy steering wheel. They think they're steering the car, but actually it's the Treasury next door that's really steering the car. And every time they put interest rates up, and then a couple of weeks later you get something come out from the Bureau of Labour Statistics saying the labour market's still strong, Warren just writes on Twitter or somewhere, who would have thought it? But we're not saying increases in interest rates cannot constrain demand. You jack them up enough, the property market crashes, if that happens, the stock market will crash, you'll get a wave of insolvencies, you'll get a recession. But it is a complicated, even complex system, the monetary system. And so far, you are absolutely right, small changes in interest rates, they may have been correlated with a decrease in inflation, but it hasn't been the economy slowing down.
Do you think they waited too long at the Fed to make the changes?
I think the way the US monetary system works now, you need to find another way of managing inflation, not relying on what... People used to question this 40 years ago when I was a student in the UK. They used to talk about the Bank of England ending up as a one-club golfer. Managing the economy is complicated.
Yeah.
And if you think you can manage the economy just by changing one thing and never doing anything else, then it might be, what's the word? It might be comforting. It might even sometimes appear to work if you're lucky. But sometimes it can be being lucky. It would be really lucky for us all if Russia and Ukraine were to come to a peace deal. Now guess what? Inflation would come down. Some central bankers around the world would go, wow, look, we jacked interest rates up, we've controlled inflation. No, there's peace in Ukraine, that's controlled inflation. Sorry, we'll come back to you in a minute. But
Are there examples of countries that were monetary sovereigns which later lost that status? And if so, what were the signals in the currency and bond markets of those countries that provided some...
you can lose... You can... the sorts of things we've been talking about, some people who used to be called post-Keynesian economists have understood for a long time. But they have tended to be on the fringe. of the economics profession, especially since the 1970s. One of them I mentioned, Hyman Minsky. There was another person who followed him at the Levy Institute called Wynne Godley, who was, prior to that, the head of the Department of Applied Economics at the University of Cambridge in England. And Wynne wrote an article in 1992 when the European countries had just signed the Maastricht Treaty. The Maastricht Treaty in 1999 set up the European Central Bank and introduced the single European currency and involved those countries voluntarily giving up their monetary sovereignty or pooling it anyway. Germany still had a lot of influence over the central bank. If you were Greece, the finance minister of Greece, when they joined, as they did eventually, could ring the president of the European Central Bank, but she might not pick up the phone. They don't have any influence, really. Now, those countries, for a variety of reasons. I mean, there are some good reasons for using the same currency across Europe. It's really convenient, it reduces transaction costs, it can promote competition. But what didn't get discussed was the downside. And Wynne, in 1992, and you can look it up online if you like, it is an article called Maastricht and All That. It was published bizarrely in the London Review of Books in 1992. And Wynne said, hang on a minute, they're going to have a single currency, they're going to have a single central bank. But as far as I know, no successful currency in history has not had a single central or federal government sitting at the top of it. So this is a really brave experiment. And what's more, he said, they don't even understand that it is a really brave experiment. And Wynne said, and in subsequent articles he said, look, the first time there is an asymmetric shock in Europe, in other words, some of the countries are really badly hit by something which other ones are not. The first time that happens, you'll have a choice between the countries on the receiving end going through something like the 1930s Great Depression to deal with it, because you don't issue a currency anymore, you really are therefore reliant on the bond market. If your economy collapses and you suddenly have a big deficit and you have to go out and find euros by selling more bonds, of course you'll get downgraded and participants on financial markets will think you're going to default, and they'll be right. It'll be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, you can react to that by making it a self-fulfilling prophecy, by seeing your debt skyrocket because the interest rate on your debt, you have to issue so much of it now, goes through the roof. Or, if you don't want to default, you can go through the Great Depression. You can have mass unemployment like they did in Greece. You can close your hospitals like they did in Greece. Well, go on. Or you can have a bailout. Yeah. And actually the three things all happened at one point or another as far as Greece was concerned. They have learned from that during the pandemic, and they haven't scrapped this yet. The European Central Bank has acted as a national central bank, and they have suspended their Stability and Growth Pact, which limited government deficits.
I actually was more concerned about the US.
It's not possible for the US to be in that position unless you can imagine the US government borrowing vast amounts of Japanese yen or euros. You cannot be forced into default on a currency that you yourself issue. You can choose to default. You can choose to default because there are some crazy people in Washington DC and they could just choose not to pay their bills. And that would be catastrophic, but that's not forced.
We could avoid default and still have a weak dollar, couldn't we?
I guess you could have a weak dollar, but, you know, what's going to be strong? The major currencies are the euro, the yen. Right. That's pretty much it, really. They can't all be weak because they're linked to each other. So actually, if you look at the patterns of exchange rates, those currencies have had periods of strength over the last 30 years, but periods of weakness. But they tend to sort of go up and down against each other because there's only two exchange rates that matter as far as the US is concerned. They matter much less in the US than they do most other countries because you don't do much international trade as a share of your economy. It's much less than we do. Australia is a small, very open economy. The US, in a way, is almost a closed economy. A lot of the things that you buy are made here, and a lot of you produce goods and services which are sold here. Really large economies like the US have exports and imports which are quite a low share of gross domestic product. It's really the very small, very open economies which are much more vulnerable as far as exchange rate fluctuations are concerned. Even in Australia. We ought to be more vulnerable than you, but since I moved to Australia in the late 1990s, we've been below 50 US cents per Australian dollar. That's what it was when I arrived. In 2011, it was 1.1 US dollars per Australian dollar. Our car factories closed because our currency was so high, because the world went completely crazy about iron ore and, bizarrely, coal and natural gas, and piled into the currency. But actually, people like me really didn't notice. It tends to be even smaller, lower income economies, for the reasons I was talking about before, especially if they're dependent on imported necessities, where it's people right at the bottom of society that are going to be affected. They're really very vulnerable to floating exchange rates, and they don't tend to have floating exchange rates, which means they've got much less freedom of action than the US does, or even Australia, or Canada, or New Zealand, or Japan.
Stephen, we have a question from online.
Okay, thank you very much.
Do it this one. Never mind, let's read it. You mentioned that if the inflation risk should be built into the budgeting process. Could you say a bit more about the difference between the budgeting process in times of inflation versus deflation?
Yeah, I mean, deflation as in falling prices is not something which commonly happens in modern capitalist economies, although it has done in Japan, but never worry. But yes, during a period of time when inflation is not such a significant risk, we just think that, I mean, for any spending proposal to be passed in Washington, it has to get the okay from the Congressional Budget Office. And you probably know this better than I do. I'm not an expert in the US political system, but that's basically how it works. Which means you have to have a pay-for. The pay-fors are sometimes actually not all that effective, because if, God bless Bernie, but if you tax billionaires to pay for government spending, the billionaires aren't going to cut back on their spending. They've got massive amounts of savings. That's where you can be a bit misled sometimes by this. You could have a balanced budget expansion where the government spends more and they imagine they're raising more because they put a wealth tax on billionaires. And I am in favour of a wealth tax on billionaires, but that's because they've got too much money. It's not because we need their money. But you think this isn't going to be inflationary because we're spending X billion, but we're raising X billion. But the billionaires from whom you're deleting that X billion, they're not going to cut back on spending by a cent. So if you are at full employment, that's still going to be inflationary, even though you're not running a deficit. This is kind of the point I'm making, and it does sort of answer the question. You need to be much more careful about your budgeting when you are close to full employment and when there's more of an inflation risk. There are things that you might like to do that you might have to defer doing, because the spare resources don't exist in the economy. Or you might have to free them up. And taxation can play a role in freeing them up. But it's not as simple, and you still have the problem, even if you do the Congressional Budget Office thing, of saying we spend a dollar, we tax a dollar. Because that doesn't deal with the real issue. The real issue is what's happening to total spending in the economy. Do we have the productive capacity? At the moment, the Congressional Budget Office confines itself to looking at forecasts of the impact of spending and taxation measures on the federal budget over, it's absurd to try and do it over 10 years, but over 10 years. They always get it wrong, but nonetheless, anyone would. This is not a criticism of them. What we're saying is that's the wrong thing to focus on. The appropriate budget position for the government should just fall out of the calculation. What we should be looking at is what programs do we want to do? Are they inflationary? Do we have the spare capacity? If we don't, can we create the spare capacity? Or do we have to scale them back or do them later? That's a much more complicated thing to do, but there are some awfully clever people in Washington, D.C. who work in the Congressional Budget Office, and that's the job that we would like them to undertake. And as I said, this was beginning to be discussed before the pandemic. We sort of several steps back because of all the experiences of the last few years, but it's something which is going to come back again. The issue is real resources and inflation risk. It's never a lack of dollars. And if you hear, again, a huge respect for Barack Obama, but he was interviewed on, I think, 60 Minutes, a program like that you have here, during the Great Recession. Are you going to run out of money? He said, we're out of money already. No, that's completely wrong. That's a terrible thing to say. Meantime, Ben Bernanke is bailing out the banks and also being interviewed on 60 Minutes. And he was asked, is that taxpayers' money you're using? This was his answer. No, it's not taxpayers' money. We just type money into the accounts the banks have at the Fed. It doesn't come from anywhere apart from the keyboard of a computer. That's what the chairman of the Federal Reserve was saying, and that's what the new president was saying. They were saying very different things. Turns out the chairman of the Federal Reserve was the one that was right, as far as that's concerned. It's so easy, isn't it? If you're in opposition and Donald Trump is the president, really easy to say, look at all this deficit spending he's doing. I mean, we should be saying, look at all the unfair things that are happening. We don't agree with this, we don't agree with that. But if you want to go on TV as an opposition politician and not even have to switch your brain on, then you just say, deficit spending. You can't do that in your household, government mustn't do it. And so easy, trouble is you then win the election. And then the other side say the same thing back to you. So we are not saying we're solving all the world's problems. We are just asking both sides of politics and the people that they advise them to be honest about the monetary system. And going right the way back to the beginning, I promise if you live to be 150, the US government will never be forced to default on debt it's issued in its own currency. And I have more or less quoted Alan Greenspan saying that. One more thing. Google Paul Ryan, Alan Greenspan. And you will find a hearing when Alan Greenspan was chairman of the Fed where Paul Ryan said, is Social Security going to become insolvent? Do we need to privatise Social Security? And Alan Greenspan says, sort of half scratches his head and looks at Paul Ryan and says, there's nothing to stop the government printing as much money as it wants. The problem is finding the real resources to supply the goods and services that the government is spending on. And as we saw, I mean, we're not arguing for limitless deficits, it's just a fact. The US federal government, almost the whole time, since there has been a United States of America, has run deficits. Year after year after year. Occasionally, you get the odd surplus. The last string of surpluses was at the end of the 1990s. Did that give you a stable and reliable financial system? Lehman Brothers came 8 years later. What was Lehman Brothers related to? Financial deregulation, the scrapping of the New Deal, restrictions on banking. When did that happen? In the late 1990s, when there were those fiscal surpluses. And there's a similar sort of story in Australia, or in the 90s I was in the UK, similar story in the UK a little bit earlier. Margaret Thatcher was very proud to end up running budget surpluses. Household debt went through the roof. Now, if somebody's got to do the deficit spending, it's usually better to have the currency issuer doing it. They can't run out of the currency, rather than to have you doing it, because you're the ones that will end up with a debt you can't repay. That's the sort of message that Stephanie is putting forward. She's on TV all the time. You'll find her on YouTube. If you haven't read it, the best-selling economics book in the world in 2020 was The Deficit Myth, which I'm pleased to say she finished writing when she was with us in Adelaide just before the pandemic in South Australia. I was looking over her shoulder while she did the last part. It's back at the top of the economic policy bestseller lists right now as well, because of recent shenanigans which the country's been going through again.
So with that,
Yeah.
I wish we could stay, but I'm afraid they're going to kick us out.
Yes, I'm
Thank
sorry,
you
I've
very
talked for
much.
far too long again.